Story recapped here. Today I'm gonna explain an action, drama, and horror film called The Shallows. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. Medical student Nancy Adams decides to go on vacation for some time alone, heading to her mother's favorite beach. Her friend Anna is supposed to join her, but the woman suddenly informs her that she can't come. However, Nancy still takes the trip alone and thanks Carlos, the man who's given her a free ride to the beach. After having a short conversation, Nancy bids Carlos goodbye and prepares to surf. She then goes into the water, grabbing a quick breath and diving under the big waves. Moments later, Nancy comes across two other surfers who inform her that there are some rocks on one side of the beach and there's only one tide a day. Nancy is grateful for the reminders, and they all wait to catch a nice wave. Eventually, Nancy and the other two surfers catch a set of waves. Then, Nancy takes a break and returns to the shore, where she looks at some of the photos of her late mother, who died from cancer. She also talks to her younger sister Chloe through a video call, telling her the beach is just as beautiful as their mother said it was. At the same time, Nancy talks to her father, who's worried that she'll drop out of medical school because she's still grieving. However, Nancy doesn't want to discuss that and just promises she'll see them soon. After that, Nancy goes into the water to surf again. Meanwhile, the other two surfers finally call it a day and tell Nancy it's getting late, but she wants to catch one last wave. However, she sees a whale carcass from afar and decides to approach it. The seagulls are going crazy over the dead animal, distracting Nancy and causing her to fall off her surfboard. Unfortunately, Nancy doesn't know that the carcass has attracted a great white shark. She then heads toward the shore, but the shark suddenly slams into her surfboard. Nancy quickly tries to get back to her surfboard after hitting some reefs, but the shark attacks and pulls her under the water. Nancy can only scream as the shark bites her leg, and as she gets separated from her surfboard, she quickly swims and gets on top of the dead whale. With a big and deep wound, Nancy takes her surfboard's ankle strap and uses it as a tourniquet. She also tries shouting for help and getting the attention of the two other surfers, but the men are too far away and fail to notice her. Meanwhile, the shark pushes the dead whale further past the shallows, where Nancy quickly swims toward a big rock as the predatory fish knocks the carcass over. Unfortunately, Nancy steps on a fire coral, but she ignores the pain and tries her best to get on top of the rock. Nancy takes a minute to catch her breath, while on the other hand, the shark circles the rock and waits for her to make a mistake. With a predator watching her every move, Nancy has no other choice but to stay on the rock and think of what to do next. In the meantime, Nancy stitches up her wound using her earrings and necklace, and despite the excruciating pain, she manages to finish it and cover her thigh with her rash guard. As the sun sets, Nancy checks her watch and sees that it's 5 hours to low tide. Unfortunately, it becomes cold as night falls, so Nancy has to use her rash guard to keep herself warm. She then loosens her tourniquet to allow blood flow in her leg, and after tightening it again, she uses the sleeve of her rash guard as a compression bandage. Moments later, Nancy tries eating a small crab since she's already starving, but she just throws it up. Meanwhile, a seagull with a broken wing eagerly eats it, leaving Nancy disgusted. As Nancy looks around, she notices that her surfboard is floating several feet away from her. She isn't sure if the shark is still out there, but she still decides to retrieve it. Unfortunately, the shark is just waiting for her, and Nancy once again hurts herself as she quickly swims back to the rock and climbs it. Minutes later, Nancy sees a drunk man passed out on the shore. Thinking she now has a chance to be rescued, Nancy repeatedly shouts until the man regains consciousness and notices her. Nancy tries telling him to call for help, but the drunk man can't understand what she's saying. Refusing to give up, Nancy motions for the man to walk to the other side of the shore and get her phone from her bag. However, instead of helping Nancy and calling for help, the man decides to steal her belongings before walking away. Exhausted and in pain, Nancy begs the man to help her, but he just ignores her and leaves. As if the phone and money aren't enough, the man goes into the water to retrieve Nancy's surfboard. Nancy can only shout and warn him that there's a shark, but he doesn't listen to her. Moments later, the shark viciously attacks the man, leaving his body torn in half as he desperately crawls back to the shore. The following day, Nancy still remains on top of the rock with only 6 hours to high tide. Meanwhile, the two surfers she's met return to the beach for more surfing. As soon as Nancy notices the men, she immediately tries to tell them to stop and get out of the water because there's a shark. However, the surfers are confident that there are no sharks in that part of the water. She also tells them to call for help, but the men don't take her seriously and just prepare to catch a wave. Unfortunately, the shark eventually shows up and eats one of the surfers while the other rushes to where Nancy is. But Nancy loses sight of him, and it isn't long before his surfboard shoots out of the water, already broken in half. Shocked, Nancy remains on top of the rock as she looks for signs that the surfer is still alive. Then suddenly, the man resurfaces and attempts climbing the rock, asking for Nancy's help. So Nancy tries her best to help the surfer, but the shark pulls him down and eats him. With 3 hours left to high tide, a dehydrated Nancy lies on top of the rock and tries to conserve her energy. At the same time, the sun is shining brightly in the sky, so Nancy uses the broken surfboard to protect herself from the heat. Moments later, with only 25 minutes to high tide, the surfer's helmet and GoPro camera float to the surface of the water. Nancy doesn't immediately notice it, for she's too tired to even move. Then, Nancy realizes that the shark is still lurking in the water, but she doesn't really have a choice but to remain in her spot. As Nancy slowly sits up, she decides to tend to the seagull's injury. Nancy carefully pops the bird's dislocated wing back in place, and although the bird bites her, she's happy that it now has a chance to escape. After that, Nancy notices that the tide is already getting high. Then, she finally sees the camera floating, thinking she can get it. Moments later, Nancy watches the shark's movements as it moves around, realizing it takes the predator 32 seconds to swim from the whale to the rock. Using her watch, Nancy perfectly times the moment she transfers to another rock to retrieve the camera. Unfortunately, she fails to get it, and she only ends up falling into the water and hitting more corals. After 32 seconds, Nancy tries to get the camera again, and this time she succeeds. However, the shark suddenly lunges at Nancy, causing her to fall into the water once more and hit her body on a rock. But despite that, Nancy notices how the shark accidentally hurt itself as it scrapes against the corals. Using that as an opportunity to get away, Nancy quickly grabs the camera and returns to the big rock, feeling victorious. A moment later, Nancy watches the camera footage and sees how the surfer was eaten by the shark. She also notices that the shark has a hook in its mouth, indicating that someone's tried hunting it. Nancy then calculates her distance from the buoy, which is about 40 yards. Thinking it'll take her 1 minute to get there. Nancy is confident that she can reach the buoy in a minute, but first, she needs a head start. With only 10 minutes to high tide, Nancy makes a video using the GoPro and tells anyone who'll find it she's been attacked by a shark, asking them to call for help. Nancy is already losing a lot of blood, and to make things worse, gangrene is already setting in. Nancy also feels like she's losing her strength, saying she thinks she doesn't have much time. Soon, the rock she's on is going to be taken by the tide, and since she's about 200 yards away from the shore, Nancy can't help but become emotional. She's also disappointed that she didn't get the chance to know the name of that beach. But eventually, Nancy realizes that recording that video is useless. She then changes her mind, asking the person who'll find the camera to send her video to Texas instead, where her sister and father live. Knowing that she might not make it home, Nancy leaves a message for her sister and father, telling them how much she loves them and that she'll fight until the end. After that, Nancy throws the camera as far as she can, hoping it'll reach the shore. She also lets the seagull float away on the broken surfboard, and as she prepares to swim, a bloom of jellyfish suddenly swims to the surface of the water. Nancy then recalls the shark getting hurt because of the coral, concluding that the predator didn't like that because it stings like a jellyfish. Realizing that the jellyfish will give her a head start, Nancy dives into the water as the shark chases her, making sure to swim among the magnificent sea creatures. Unfortunately, she ends up getting stung, but that is a small price to pay to avoid getting eaten by the shark. As soon as Nancy sees that she's close to the buoy, she immediately swims toward it and ignores all the pain she feels in her body. However, the shark slams into the buoy, and Nancy falls into the water when she holds onto a rusty rung that suddenly breaks. Still, Nancy doesn't give up and instead uses the broken rung to stab the shark before returning to the buoy. A few minutes later, Nancy spots a ship from afar and quickly searches the buoy for anything that'll help her get the vessel's crew's attention, eventually finding a flare gun. However, she accidentally drops the bullets into the water, so she tries to retrieve them immediately. She then fires the flare gun in the air upon getting one bullet, but it isn't enough. With no other choice, Nancy grabs the rest of the bullets and fires the flare gun once again, but unfortunately, the ship has already turned away. Meanwhile, the camera finally reaches the shore and is picked up by a little boy, who immediately goes home after watching Nancy's video. On the other hand, the shark slams into the buoy, breaking one of the chains securing into the seabed. Pissed, Nancy takes the flare gun and fires directly at the shark, which only angers it. The shark then continues attacking the buoy, and as Nancy looks for a way to finally kill the predatory fish, she decides to fire into the water and set the oil from the dead whale on fire. Unfortunately, Nancy doesn't really hurt the shark and only angers it, causing it to attack the buoy once again and break another chain. Nancy then falls into the water and gets a nasty cut from a bar, but that doesn't stop her from staying inside the now toppled over buoy. Seconds later, the relentless shark chomps down on the buoy and almost destroys it, forcing Nancy to jump into the water. She then ties her ankle strap to the last chain of the buoy and yanks it, causing her to be pulled down as it falls to the seabed. Meanwhile, the shark pursues Nancy. However, the shark doesn't have time to change its direction and ends up getting impaled on the anchor's rebar. On the other hand, the little boy shows Nancy's video to his father, who is revealed to be Carlos. They then return to the beach and find Nancy floating near the shore, so Carlos quickly gets into the water to save her. Carlos also instructs his son to get help, and as Nancy regains consciousness and looks around, she sees the seagull that she's saved. At the same time, Nancy sees a vision of her mother smiling down at her, and all she can say is that she's okay. Despite the traumatizing incident, Nancy goes to a beach in Galveston, Texas 1 year later, ignoring the big scar on her thigh. She's now a doctor and has decided to teach her younger sister how to surf, making their father say their mother would be proud of them.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.